Hello, everybody. Welcome into Fantasy Pros. I'm Ryan Wormeli, joined by my friend, Dr. Deepak Chona. He is Sport MD Analysis. We have done many shows together over the years, some live shows, some pre-recorded. I believe last year you and I did the same thing we're going to do today, which is a bit of a season preview from an injury perspective, sort of a short form video where we hit on about a dozen or so names here and just give folks who are drafting this weekend, because as we talked about before we started recording, it is the biggest draft weekend of the year. Give them some last-minute injury insights from an actual doctor here about what to expect from maybe some of these recovery timelines. A lot of the stuff that you do is really backed by data and kind of the science behind this. So you obviously come to this with a lot of expertise in terms of, evaluating these injuries as best we can from afar and seeing what's going to happen. Does that sound like a good plan here?
Yeah, that sounds great. Appreciate that. And let's get it rolling.
I will remind everybody that all of our 2025 consensus rankings and tiers can be found at fantasypros.com/rankings. And also, I do just want to take a moment to kind of thank the audience as we're sort of wrapping up our off-season coverage. Obviously not wrapping up Fantasy Pros, stuff in general. We have a whole lot coming your way in season, but sort of wrapping up the off-season part of the programming. Just thanks everybody for listening throughout the summer. And, the best way to support the show is by leaving a review and make it an honest one. If you have feedback, we want to hear it. But by leaving a review at fantasypros.com/review and by rating the show wherever it is that you're listening to your podcast. So we really appreciate the feedback. It helps to grow the show and also make it better. We want to make the show kind of our best foot forward as best as we possibly can. So I wanted to get that out of the way. Let's dive into some injuries to know before your drafts. I want to start kind of with the 49ers in general. Brandon Aiyuk, somebody who obviously he's got a delayed start to his season last year with some of the holdout stuff, and then he ends up missing a large chunk of the season with an injury. What can you tell us about Aiyuk?
Yeah, so he's going to start the season on PUP. It looks like that was kind of the expectation all along. I wouldn't really consider that a setback. With most of these injuries, he was projected to be about an 11-month type return. His was more than just an ACL, so ACL-MCL combo. Takes a little bit longer to return. The comments suggested somewhere around a week 6 target might be realistic, and the data that we had projected him for mid to late October, so that is fairly consistent. The one thing to keep in mind with these types of players coming back is wide receivers off the combo ACL-MCL usually take about a 6-game ramp up to see their target volume get back to normal. So with that in mind, we think he's in for potentially a strong last third of the season, but the early phase of his return may be a little up and down, and we're not really planning on using him ourselves in most of those lineups.
Yeah, that's, when you talk about a delayed start and then also a ramp up period once you get back, you're basically at the fantasy playoffs already, which is hard to imagine sitting here in August, but, it does come quickly. So, discouraging if you're counting on him in any kind of redraft format. It's interesting because there are really multiple 49ers that you could talk about. It feels like basically all the wide receivers like Jauan, Jennings, although, who knows how much of that is like kind of a sort of a hold in, like with some of the contract negotiating stuff, like Ricky Pearsall. Obviously he started last year, with the chest gunshot wound. So very different situation this year. Obviously we don't even have him on the list to talk about, but everybody knows what happened with Christian McCaffrey a year ago. It seems like all the 49ers are at least worth just saying like, hey, be aware of some injury stuff. So the guys besides Aiyuk, can you weigh in on any of them?
Yeah, so Jauan Jennings is an interesting case. If it is truly an injury, it's a re-aggravated calf strain, and that the initial aggravation dates all the way back to OTAs. So those tend to carry a very high re-injury risk in season for a wide receiver, and he's had a lot of time to recover, but even still, they're talking about this potential IR, and it's very uncertain how much of this is injury versus contract. So with that in mind, we would suspect, not unlike McLaurin coming off of PUP right after his contract, that sort of thing. So I wouldn't be surprised if that's the case. Most of these re-aggravated calf strains, within 6 weeks of rest, you would start to see players at least try to ramp up. So if they're still talking about IR and it truly is an injury-related concern, we wouldn't bank on Jauan Jennings in really any capacity. And then you look at Ricky Pearsall. Now, he had a hamstring injury that made him start training camp on the inactive list, but he very quickly came back from it. It doesn't look like it's affected him at all during training camp, and he's been available the whole time. So with that in mind, that would predict that he doesn't have any lingering risk going into the season. So Ricky Pearsall, we would basically fully send on. Nothing from last year really overly concerning. And then this year, really no reason to doubt him so far.
Pearsall is somebody that, as a Fantasy Pros team, we are going full send in terms of just the rankings in general. So that's very good to hear, because we consider him to be one of the real key breakout candidates for the season at wide receiver. So a clean bill of health will certainly go a long way towards that. I want to let everybody know that you can get in the game. Best Ball is live at DraftKings. $15 million is on the line with real stakes and real excitement. Best Ball is the biggest fantasy contest at DraftKings, talking a $15 million guaranteed prize pool with 2 millionaires being crowned for first and second place. Play season-long fantasy football the DraftKings way. With Best Ball, there's no waiver wires and no roster management. You get bigger rosters, so injuries won't end your season. Just draft your team and you're set. If a shot at winning a share of $15 million isn't enough to get you excited, check this out. DraftKings is offering everyone a draft one, get one special. Your $20 entry fee scores you a bonus ticket. Download the DraftKings app and use code FANTASYPROS. That's code FANTASYPROS for all customers who enter the NFL Best Ball $15 million millionaire contest to get a bonus ticket and get a shot at being crowned one of 2 millionaires only on DraftKings. All right, next name here. And by the way, outside of putting the 49ers together, there's not really a whole lot of rhyme or reason to the order. Just kind of wrote out the names as I had them here. So there's not like we're going position by position or anything like that. The next name I have written down is Chris Godwin, who was on pace to be, wide receiver 1 in fantasy early last season, was having a ridiculous season, obviously has another season-ending injury. It's been interesting because they gave him the contract early in the offseason, and that seemed to most people, based on the terms of the contract, to suggest that, hey, maybe the team says there's not actually that much injury concern here. Then they go out and draft a first-round wide receiver who's looked really good. Now there's, talk about Godwin like being on PUP and everything. So just kind of taking into all the different factors that we've had over the last several months. What's your analysis on Chris Godwin right now?
Yeah, so super hard to bank on much here. So the Chris Godwin most recent update just today is that he passed his physical, and Todd Bowles announced week 2 to 5 is roughly when he's expecting a return for Godwin. But keep in mind that he hasn't even practiced yet with the team. So there was some skepticism that he's even been running yet. I think he probably, my guess is he has, if he didn't make the PUP list. Now, with Chris Godwin's injury, he fractured and dislocated his ankle. There's some torn ligaments as part of that as well. Just the complex of that injury usually creates a 12-month performance dip of up to about 20%. But then that's with a single surgery and a normal sort of post-op recovery course. You have to remember Chris Godwin had a second surgery, which means there was some sort of complication, and we don't know the details of what was done at that second surgery, but it kind of implies that you're going to push his recovery timeline even further back. So, but his injury was a week 8. So you would expect about week 8 for him to hit his 90% level if you were looking at a smooth recovery course. Now you're pushing that back. It's unclear to when, but my guess is at least about a month in terms of, if we're kind of being conservative with that estimate. So with that in mind, I'm not really banking on Chris Godwin. I think he will be out there. My guess is more towards the later end of what Bowles suggested, probably around that week 5 timeline. But in terms of him being a high level or high volume contributor, I think they're going to have to ramp him up. And I think his efficiency very likely will dip as well.
So that, kind of along those lines, would suggest that it is probably a good idea. Another, receiver who has been moving up draft boards, similar to Ricky Pearsall, is Emeka Egbuka. And that would sort of go along with what you're saying here too, that it is smart to feel like the Bucs are going to rely on Egbuka early. He's going to have this real runway because not only will Godwin not be on the field to start, when he is on the field, we're expecting a bit of a, delayed kind of ramp up period again. So, arrow up for Egbuka in that regard. Obviously, you don't want to see that due to an injury, but that is sort of the fallout of it. One player who is basically not even on my draft board, I'm curious to hear if you agree with that from the injury perspective, is Joe Mixon. What are we doing with Mixon at this point?
Yeah, Joe Mixon. There's a lot of concern that he might not play at all this year. And it sounds like he's been dealing with an injury since at least May. Now, you would think about most non-operative injuries, 3 to 4 months, and still not really any sign of him practicing or healing is pretty doubtful in terms of making a lot of progress over the next, let's say, month or two, given that it's been this long already. Reportedly, he may have had a procedure that wasn't really approved by the team, and there's some skepticism about maybe it didn't work. And that's kind of the latest of what we've been hearing. Again, none of this is verified by the team, but at the same time, with Joe Mixon, he's also had a severe foot and ankle history, even as recently as last year, missing time with a bad high ankle. So not really banking on much here, looking very much at the committee approach for the Texans running back room.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, he's basically not even on my draft board at this point, given everything. And I will if somebody else takes a huge risk and it pans out, good for them. It will not be me on draft day. Another kind of veteran running back here, Najee Harris, obviously had this stuff going on with the eye and the fireworks over the summer and 4th of July. You know, a lot of people are really excited about Marion Hampton and see this as an opportunity for Hampton to really, solidify his kind of grip on this backfield. Harris is the type of player that Jim Harbaugh really does like, though. So if he's on the field, I'm still worried about him kind of eating into those Hampton carries. What do we expect out of Harris in terms of being on the field and being productive?
Yeah, Najee Harris they called it a superficial eye injury, but it dates back to the July 4th weekend. And you're now looking at about 7-8 weeks later that he's now cleared and returning to practice and that sort of thing. So it looks like he's going to be playing week 1, but obviously he's missed all the reps. So the question is, yes, he's a veteran running back. Maybe he just plugs right in. It's more of a usage question, but I don't think it's so much of an injury question, if that makes sense. Most likely, the only injury impact you're going to see from this going forward is just him having missed training camp.
Okay. One player who missed large chunks of training camp, Matthew Stafford. And I'm really curious to get your opinion on this one for 2 reasons. One, Stafford is a real key to multiple fantasy players' value, right? Like, we need this offense to be good for Kyren Williams to have scoring opportunities. We need the quarterback to be good for guys like Puka Nacua and Devontae Adams to take advantage. I'm also curious because it's been kind of an interesting journey, right? He was on, I'm not even going to pretend to remember what all that stuff was called, but that like glass table thing with his back, like that they had the like Airstream looking, I'm clearly, you can tell I have no medical background in talking about this, but what do you make of just everything that's been going on with Stafford? And, a guy who's older, there's, everybody always makes a joke, like nobody used to have a bad back. It's just something you deal with. So like, are you nervous about Stafford from a fantasy perspective?
Yeah, very, to be honest. So I do think he's going to start week 1. He's probably going to look pretty good when he's healthy. The issue with him is going to be managing this back injury all season long. He's been having epidural shots. That implies to me he probably had some sort of disc herniation, and those discs can slip out and basically pinch on nerves. And Matthew Stafford's tough, but it's almost impossible to play through that level of pain. Nerve pain is extremely severe in a lot of cases. So the issue is, if he's being managed with these injections, would a bad hit or a bad trunk rotation when he's throwing lead to him re-aggravating this? Very possibly, yes. So I have been avoiding the Rams wide receivers as much as tempting as it is. But the reason just being, even though I expect Stafford to start healthy, there's going to be a super high re-aggravation risk all season long.
Wide receiver, I want to ask you about Jayden Reed. What do you have for us here?
Yeah, Jayden Reed actually just returned to practice today. So he was seen in a boot as recently as 2 weeks ago. They were calling it a foot sprain. And most likely, the most common thing here would be a midfoot area sprain, given that it took him about 6 weeks to get back in the game. With that in mind, you would think that Jayden Reed, having returned to practice today, would probably be a full participant by the time next week rolls around in the lead up to week 1. So I would think he plays. I don't think he has a lot of restriction, but there is some concern that this may have some effect on how much they use him early on. Just because, like I said, 2 weeks ago, he was in a boot and looked like he was even limping in some videos that were circulating online. So today he looked pretty sharp from the brief highlights that we've seen. And I do think he's going to play week 1 without major dip.
I'm interested to see what the usage is for him, because I feel like I've been maybe too low on Matthew Golden for a lot of the summer. And if Reed is like at all rusty or limited just in any capacity, then that just, gives even more of an opening for their first round pick at receiver to take advantage early on in the season. How about De'Von Achane? Obviously one of like the biggest names that we're talking about just in terms of like when healthy, where they're going. They, RB8 in real-time ADP, which is available on Fantasy Pros now to kind of see where these guys are really actually going, not just from year-long ADP, but from the last 24 hours. And then also the last 7 days, you can see those trends. He's RB8, but he's down to about 17th overall. That is definitely lower than when he was going like kind of early on before more of this injury stuff cropped up. One of the reasons that I've been a little wary of Achane in previous drafts is because it's multiple guys need to stay healthy, right? It's him and Tua needs to be healthy for Achane to be really effective. And that just scares me, kind of having an extra person involved that you're worried about. But just thinking about Achane specifically, Is any injury stuff with him enough that you think he should be kind of falling far out of the first round? Or if you want to take the big upside swing on him regardless, do you think it's worth investing in that?
Yeah, I think he's worth investing in. I probably wouldn't take him as my first pick, but as a second rounder, I think is very reasonable. The issue with Achane is that he had a calf strain. We never really know the severity of these things until the player returns to practice, because that we find is the only real objective indicator. The teams are at a little bit of disincentive to tell us the truth. They don't have to report any of the preseason injuries, honestly. And with Achane, the question is, he's an explosive player. There is going to be a re-aggravation risk with the calf. Now, if he does return next week to practice, which is what we're projecting, what all the comments have suggested so far, then that would have him at 2 weeks out and about a 10% re-injury risk, which is relatively low, but not zero. The real concern here is if they are misleading us, and you may remember Christian McCaffrey's supposed calf injury last year in this time. If they are misleading us, we won't find out until last minute, and we will likely see an extended absence. But in the absence of an aggravation, you would generally see Achane progress on. And the GM just came out today saying he's going to play week 1. So with that in mind, we expect him to return to practice next week and probably not have a huge re-aggravation risk, given that this was likely a mild injury.
In fantasy sports, flexibility is everything, especially when you're managing injuries, bye weeks, or tough matchups. Your finances deserve the same level of control, and that's exactly what Klarna delivers. Klarna is your smarter, everyday spending partner. Inside the app, you can track purchases, compare prices, find deals, earn cash back, and choose to pay now or later with no interest when payments are made on time. It's the kind of tool that helps you stretch your money further and make every purchase count. This isn't about spending more, it's about spending wisely. Klarna fits seamlessly into how you already shop, whether you're picking up groceries, upgrading tech, or even just keeping an eye on your budget. Klarna gives you the financial flexibility to shop smart and stay in control, just like a good roster move. Download the Klarna app or head to Klarna.com to learn more. CA resident loans made or arranged pursuant to a California finance law license, NMLS number 1353190. Klarna balance account required. Klarna may get a commission. Limitations, terms, and conditions apply. How about another big name running back here, Kenneth Walker, who is going a couple rounds later than Achane is. And, you know, we've talked on the show that the upside is as significant as almost anybody in fantasy. But for me, like, I'm not worried about usage. I'm not worried about anything. I'm worried about these like kind of nagging injuries that have continued to crop up for Walker over the years. You know, always feels like he's on the practice report, like injury designation as like some kind of foot injury or something. Obviously, he's dealt with some of that here in August. So going into draft day, are you willing to draft Kenneth Walker despite the kind of litany of injury reports and everything that have added up over the years?
Yeah, it's a good question. He's been on the injury report a lot. Now, with that being said, he's somewhat of a value where he's going compared to what his role is projected to be. And if you also look at his overall history, he hasn't missed that many more games than the average running back. The one thing this year that does kind of stand out, yes, he has a prior soft tissue history with recurrent kind of core, abdomen, groin type injuries. And that does raise his risk a touch over the average running back. But this year, the question in my eyes is why hasn't he been practicing that consistently? They've called it foot soreness, which suggests overall not a high concern and not any like major structural damage that's going to keep him out. And he has been intermittently practicing and reportedly looking good. But given that Zach Charbonnet is as talented as he is, he's a second round running back, always been efficient when he's out there, and he's been getting all these rave reviews, I would think that Kenneth Walker, if he were truly fully healthy, would have priority in terms of being out there to compete with Charbonnet and to keep him as the backup rather than split that load. So that's the one concern with Kenneth Walker. I do think that foot soreness may be a little more serious than they're letting on. But with that being said, you know, the history itself, not highly concerning just because he is a running back, and wear and tear is actually quite common with these guys.
Let's look at another backfield with kind of a possibility for split carries, at least when guys are healthy. That's the Titans. Tyjae Spears, a popular sleeper for a lot of people early on in draft season. Of course, now he has, you know, his injury stuff that is going to, I believe, keep him out. Actually, I'm not sure. I'll defer to your expertise. But for a certain number of weeks here, is it going to be long enough that you would say that you should bump up a guy like Tony Pollard in your rankings? And we're worried about the effectiveness of Spears when he comes back from the ankle issue.
Yeah, I would. I would bump up
Okay.
Tony Pollard. And the other aspect to it is that Tyjae Spears, so he's going to miss the first 4 games. That's official. But when he comes back, even if he comes back week 5, given the timeline, we know it's a severe high ankle. So most players don't come back right away as their pre-injury selves. They usually have about a 20% dip in their performance. And with the severe high ankles, usually a 20-25% re-injury risk in season. So all of those numbers are pretty high. The other aspect to it is usually you'll see a ramp up in their touches while the other running backs on the team, whether that's Pollard or someone else, get more of the workload in the interim. So I do think Tony Pollard deserves a bump up, and Tyjae Spears, very hard to justify drafting at this point.
You know, I have to squeeze in a Raven here with you on. I'm not going to ask about Lamar Jackson's foot getting stepped on because that seems to be a non-issue. I am not stressing about it. I want that clear and on the record. But I do want to ask you about Isaiah Likely because I was really expecting big things from Likely this season. I still am to a degree, but like I went into this offseason saying like I think he explodes this year. I think if Mark Andrews ever misses any time, Likely is going to be like a top 3 tight end in fantasy. Like that is how strongly I feel about his talent and his fit in this offense. And then he breaks a bone in his foot and I, as somebody who's currently dealing with a small broken fracture in my foot, who is not a professional athlete, I can relate to how, frustrating and difficult it can be to navigate that. So when you look at somebody like Likely, I believe they have said he's not going on IR, so they do expect him back early in the season. But in terms of effectiveness, is there like a point in time where we would think he gets back to 100% and maybe is taking some of that workload away from Mark Andrews? Is that sooner rather than later? What do we make of the broken foot?
Yeah, so the most common injury here is going to be a Jones fracture. And assuming that is kind of the most likely, the average on these, even though 6 weeks is possible, the average is 8. 6 weeks would have put him back for about week 1. Now, 8 weeks puts him closer to week 3. He is reportedly not going to be on the IR or the PUP, so therefore has a good chance of coming back in the first 4 weeks. And our data was always projecting him week 2 to 4 as most likely. The real question, though, is, as you said, performance. And typically players do take about a month in terms of pass catching production to get back to where they were before. So I think he comes back. The data says week 3 is the most likely here. And then after that, you see a 3 to 4 game ramp up in terms of his efficiency, production, and volume. And then, yes, he could, depending on how they decide to use him, very, very much look like his old self.
Mark Andrews currently real-time ADP is tight end 7, about the 71st overall pick. So something to keep in mind with Likely, given where he's at in his recovery, that Andrews is going kind of in that tier 2, like middle class or so of tight end. If you are worrying about injuries, this is a good episode to listen to. If you're worrying about making your lineups and optimizing them, let Autopilot help. Autopilot can manage your fantasy football lineup automatically, so you never have to worry about last-minute changes. Auto swap inactive players and ensure your lineup is always optimized, even when you can't be online. Take control with the flexibility to approve lineup changes via email or let Autopilot handle everything. Stay ahead with My Playbook Autopilot, available now for Fantasy Pros Premium subscribers at fantasypros.com/myplaybook or on the Fantasy Pros app. Try Premium for free right now by claiming your 3-day trial of Fantasy Pros Premium at fantasypros.com/premium. We'll go ahead and wrap things up there. Got through a lot of names for you. For Dr. Deepak Chona, I'm Ryan Wormeli. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Good luck in your final drafts this weekend. We'll see you next time.